Welcome back. You're watching Newsfeed PM, the second and final round of our discussion about intersectionality in South Africa, with a particular focus on women and the law. I still have my two guests, Professors Cathi, Albertyn and Thuli Madonsela. I want to come to you then, Professor Albertyn, and talk about intersectionality and law and legislation as an instrument by which to address that. Is it our best option?
Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly you want government, without lawyers being involved, making the right policy and legislative decisions in terms of regulating our society in a way that prioritizes the interests of disadvantaged groups. If law fails to do that through the legislature, then of course we want to use the courts, we want to use litigation to be able to advocate on behalf of those groups that have been excluded. And that has been a fairly successful strategy for a number of groups in South Africa. Certainly the LGBTI group, who were recognized in the Constitution and then largely ignored in legislation, were able to drive through substantive judgments that led to recognition of themselves, of their relationships, and finally of marriage. And that was a really, really successful use of a group. It wasn't necessarily particularly intersectional because it was a kind of strategic essentialism around sexual orientation on its own, which garnered some kinds of criticism around the exclusion maybe of black lesbians, etc., and that can give rise to a whole lot of debates. Women have also been successful. Women living under customary law have been able to win rights around marriage and property and inheritance, and even around traditional leadership through courts. Women living in Muslim marriages who have been stunningly ignored by the legislature have been able to win a series of statutory rights through the courts for access to matrimonial property. So it works both ways. We hope that government and Parliament and the ruling party are going to get it right. If they aren't, then we are going to act on behalf of groups of women and other disadvantaged groups to try and secure the rights that they deserve.
Just on that point about acting on behalf of groups, how much of a barrier does access and finances remain as far as women being able to use these opportunities to fight for equality, justice, and a seat at the table?
If you're talking about going to courts, it's a huge barrier. So the only way in which it can be really successful is with the support of social justice NGOs and trade unions. So the recent successful claim by domestic workers for inclusion in the legislation that provided compensation for occupational disease and injury really was supported by an American NGO and a South African NGO and the Domestic Workers Union, and it took a lot of effort in order to win that particular victory. That would not have been possible by a single domestic worker working on her own.
The sad reality, Prof. Madonsela, is that NGOs cannot reach and assist everyone. So for those who don't have access to an NGO that focuses on their particular struggle, what other help is there?
Well, that's why from our side we say training of judges and training of policymakers in government should be prioritized. The instruments that I've spoken about, SIAM and the Social Justice Explorer, try to do that. And Prof. Albertyn speaks, for example, about litigating on justice matters for these groups that are oppressed. What we would like to see, though, is what Justice Mlambo is doing, where you're not litigating about the oppressed groups. You're dealing with an ordinary matter, but we want the judge and the lawyers to wear an intersectional lens and a social justice lens. And in looking at things that seem to be ordinary, to be mainstream, for example, Justice Mlambo picked up the fact that mortgages, the enforcement of mortgages was in such a way that people's homes were being sold for something like 10,000 rand. A home that is worth 500,000 was sold for 10,000 rand. But he then picked a pattern on the intersection of race and class, that the majority of the people whose homes were being sold were black people, because historically they were excluded from owning property. and they don't have much of the means. They don't have the history of maintaining mortgages, and they don't have additional resources to draw on when they've been fired from their jobs or they've lost their income. And he and his team went into that, and they asked for the rules to be reviewed, the mortgage rules. And they found that actually in the end, everyone benefits, because these auctions were being advertised in places where only 2 or 5 people who are regulars in these auction gigs will see the advert. And that's why at the end of the day, the banks are losing and the people are losing. The Tuma Foundation has been dealing with the issue of transfer of property to widows. If your husband is dead, your property is being transferred to you. Again, the rule makers made these rules for everyone. But if you look at those rules from an intersectional lens, if you were using SIAM, you would understand that the affected people will not have money. They will only have that property. Now, to pay for conveyancing, they have to sell this property, and it has created chaos, and it has deprived people of their homes. And therefore, what we're saying is NGOs can assist people to litigate. But incidentally, Prof. Cathi, we've been talking to one of your successors, Professor Tsepo Madlingozi, to say, when we are advancing change, let's look at litigation, but let's also look at policy reform. When I was still at Wits, we were very strong on suggesting policy reform as well, because in that way we move the needle for many people than when we litigate and move the needle for just that person or a few people.
And Prof. Albertyn, just on that point then, is our legislation, is the legal system, are they flexible enough given all of these urgent issues that require addressing for the women of this country?
So, Prof. Madonsela is perfectly right. I think it's only when policy and legislation fails, and I think I was trying to make that point, that litigation actually comes in. And actually what I say to my students is, don't go and be social justice lawyers, go and be government officials, because it's in government that we need the good policy makers, and we need the people who are able to be nimble and creative and who are able to respond to the needs of our society. And we need more young people, and I just don't think we have enough of those people going into government and doing the work that's needed. So we need to capacitate government, we need to capacitate policymakers. I absolutely agree with Prof. Madonsela, and we also need social justice lawyers to fill the gaps. Unfortunately, at the moment, I think we almost have too much litigation and not enough policymakers. So I think at some level we have to get the balance right.
And Prof. Madonsela, you've participated in conversations such as this for years now, as have you, Prof. Albertyn. And I want to ask you both this in 30 seconds each. Beyond August and these invitations, are you seeing enough of these discussions and dialogues translating into action? Prof. Madonsela, you can go first.
We are seeing things translating into action. If you look at women who have been pushing, for example, for a much more agent and a more comprehensive approach to gender-based violence, that has resulted in a comprehensive and integrated strategy on gender-based violence. Of course, at the end of the day, it's going to be about implementation, but that strategy has also been backed by money. If you look at, again, the judiciary, much as a lot of it does not come to the public, but there's been a lot of training on judges from during my time when we were training them on the Equality Act, and we had an additional course for them, which was social context awareness. And that social context awareness was making them understand that they're not virgins, as Justice Edwin Cameron once said. All of us are not ideological virgins. We bring into these spaces a lens that belongs to our class, to our race, to our gender, and to all of the experiences we've had. So that training is taking place. And at the level of policy, the Minister of Justice recently said he's willing to engage to come to the social justice network that we've created at Stellenbosch University and talk to us about using tools that will help policymakers to design their policies in a social justice conscious way and in a manner that is conscious of human diversity and meets all people where they are,
Professor
instead
Albertyn?
of one size fits all.
unfortunately, we're running out of time. Very briefly, ma'am, your response. Are we seeing more of the conversations becoming action?
Yes, and the thing that excites me most about conversations becoming action is it's the younger generation that is now doing it. And I think that we're seeing a return of gender politics, we're seeing a return of feminist activism, and we're seeing a return of deeply intelligent, creative response